Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. I'm your host, Matthew Felix, and I'm here today with Linda Joy Meyers. Linda Joy is president and founder of the National Association of Memoir Writers. Her memoir, Don't Call Me Mother, A Daughter's Journey from Abandonment to Forgiveness, was a Foreword INDIES Book of the Year Award finalist and winner of the BAIPA Gold Medal Award. She's the author of 3 books about memoir writing: The Power of Memoir, How to Write Your Healing Story, Journey of Memoir, and Becoming Whole. She's also co-author with Brooke Warner of 2 books, Breaking Ground on Your Memoir and Magic of Memoir. Linda Joy writes for the Huffington Post and co-teaches the program Write Your Memoir in 6 Months with Brooke. She has been a therapist for 36 years. She speaks about memoir, healing, and the power of writing the truth. Welcome, Linda Joy.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's great to be here with you.
I am excited to be here with you. I've wanted to have this conversation. I've wanted to have you back on the show. This is actually your second time. I've never had the chance, however, to interview you. So I was excited and grateful when you accepted the invitation. So let's start with just a really basic question. What is memoir? Particularly, how is it different from biography or autobiography?
Oh, right. Well, a memoir is the story of often a theme or themes in your life. And it's an autobiography is like I was born and then I haven't died yet, but almost, kind of long arc thing. A memoir is usually themed, although it can cover lots of years. And most importantly, it's not just the what happened story, but it's the what meaning did you make of this journey on earth, and how can you best get the feeling and the expression of that over to the reader. Okay.
It seems as if, this is just anecdotal. This is just my impression. So you would know more about this, but it just seems as if memoirs are becoming more and more popular. Is my impression, is there some truth to that? Thoughts on that?
We have so many waiting lists for our classes now. It's crazy. But, back in the day when I started writing Don't Call Me Mother, which was my first memoir, your memoir wasn't a thing. Only famous people wrote them. It was before Mary Karr and Tobias Wolff, for instance, who began we think of them as sort of beginning this version of what memoir has become. And so what's interesting is, why is this? People who don't like what's happening will say things like, everybody and their dog is writing a memoir, and what is all this? Oh, it can't be therapy. And, so, there's a range of what's being written and what's being read. But I just think that the thing over the last 20 years has evolved because people are desperate to understand how other people managed this time on earth, and given what happens to people. And also, with social media developing, it's more okay to share stuff now than it was 20 years ago, or 10 even. It's changed in 10 years so much. So I think it's almost like a instruction manual in the form of story. How do we do this? How do we make sense? How do we heal? How do we keep going sometimes? And how did you do it? And so that's what the reader's asking for in a memoir.
Right. I love that observation that basically the times have also changed. Just that whole notion that, now we do as a society, we share so much that 10 or 20 years, certainly 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago, like you said, we wouldn't even dream of sharing. And the younger generations, they just don't have filters that even remotely resemble.
They share more than I would, but
right. The times are changing. But I love how you make that connection to why memoirs are becoming increasingly popular. What sort of trends are we seeing right now in memoirs? Are there any sort of trends, or is it just kind of along the general lines of what you were just describing?
Well, it's how memoir is being written. Now, back in the early days of 10 years ago, let's say, Brooke and I started teaching our Write Your Memoir in 6 Months class in 2012. So we're going to have probably a virtual glass of champagne next year to celebrate that. But we were teaching pretty much, our focus was on narration and scene and characterization and a narrative arc and those ways of of writing a memoir. I mean, partly because a lot of people that came to us already had sort of a fragmented bunch of stuff they were trying to figure out what to do with.
Right.
And can this be a story? Can it be shaped into something? And so we were leaning on the, look for your narrative arc, look for your act 1, 2, and 3, and so on. But what's happened, especially in the last 5 years now, in the last year or two, is make way for the family memoir, where you're writing about all these other people. And then how do you go into their point of view? Will the memoir police come and get you if you do? Remember, the memoir police went on duty when James Fry got in trouble with Oprah. Mm-hmm. And the memoir police said that was fiction. He did fictionalize. He did admit it too. But then people kind of went all crazy about, I can't say this and I can't say that, and I can't know this and I can't know that. And they got very scared, understandably. It was kind of rough for memoirs. Well, that's been healed. Oprah apologized, so did he. We've all moved on. And now it's like, well, how can you artistically create a story that isn't just through this narrow lens? And so the family memoir, and I can talk more about how I solved that problem if you want to later, but so the family memoir is coming along. Now we're getting more fragmentation because experience isn't all smoothed out. We're getting more fragmented, little tiny, like a whole page has a sentence in some of the recent memoirs, or more essay, where if your life was fragmented and you're writing a fragmented essay, it better, book, it better shows what you went through, Mm-hmm. So things are really, really changing, coming into way new acceptance of more acceptance, I think, of form. Yeah.
Right. Fascinating. So you just mentioned your own experience, and I want to talk specifically about you and how you got into memoir. So can you share with us just a little bit of why and when you started writing memoir, and what it was about that genre that attracted you?
Well, before I talk about writing it, I want to talk about what got me interested in memory mm-hmm. and the past. Okay. So the theme of my life is that I was raised by a grandmother who had left her daughter behind, who was my mother, to go do other things, which I'll talk again more about later. And my mother did the same with me. And so I had this fragmented story. But luckily, when I was a little girl, my grandmother, who was raising me, took me to Iowa, which was a 3-day drive in those days from Oklahoma, where we were living. And I got to meet my great-grandmother. And so and she was 80 and I was 8. And the first few days we were there, she began something that I'm sure changed my life. She would take out her teeth and put them in a glass by the bed, and she would tell me the stories about her life. And she started talking about how she got married in 1894 on a snowy New Year's Day. She told me about that, and she told me about her husband, Lewis. And then she told me that he died 8 weeks after she was married. Mm. And she talked about how that felt and what that was. And it turned out my grandmother was born into this woman and she didn't have a father, which was also an issue in all of our lives, this sort of theme. And so as she told me these stories and hung out with me, and she would talk to me, some adults don't talk to young children, but she did. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh my God, she is the mother of the mother, and she knows everything. And I'm going to hang around her and get all these stories. And so I became insatiably curious. Including in adulthood, when all of my grandmother's half brothers and sisters, all 6 of them, were like, would you quit asking us about the past, please?
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
Would you shut up? And I wouldn't, because it was early training to be a therapist, to have that kind of childhood also. So I wanted to know the origin of things. Like, how did this all come to happen? How did this person, not because they were all wrong or bad. At times I thought that, but what is the brokenness? And then what is the thing you're trying to do to make it better kind of arc? in these people's lives. And I did everything I could to find out about that, which led to a long journey. So then what got me to teaching memoir was, as a therapist, you have these little exercises that you end up doing, to explore yourself. And so one of them was, what is it that obsesses you?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, and it was about looking for another career, kind of, besides being therapist. It had to do with, and I was like, well, memory. I'm obsessed with memory. Well, can you create a career out of memory? Oh, but wait.
Maybe I can.
Memoir wasn't a thing, though. So I was coming out of sort of nowhere. I had a degree from Mills in creative writing. I wanted to teach. And I was a therapist. I thought, well, maybe I can put those things together. And that was before Memoir is Healing had even been discussed much at all. But I had three people I got from a newspaper ad, and we met in Berkeley and started teaching memoir writing, never knowing where it would go, just knowing this is what I needed to do.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Can you tell us just briefly about the two memoirs that you have written, just kind of the elevator pitches for both of those so people have a sense?
Sure. Yeah. So Don't Call Me Mother was written first as journal entries and first as fiction. And then I was in my MFA program at Mills, and it's about the generations of mothers and what happened. And I was trying to break that chain. And I was reading something, and they said, and it was a scene where people were arguing and fighting and throwing dishes. My mother and grandmother, it was pretty intense. And they're like, you can't have people acting like that. You can't, that's just ridiculous. I mean, they were kind of editing the life, not just the story. But I said, but it really happened. And then they said, well, then you're writing a memoir. I'm like, what's that? Really? I mean, I'm not famous. So that's how that got started. And so but it's in the point of view of me as a child from the beginning in the present tense. I tend to want to analyze everything too much. So when I put it in the past tense, I'd end up dropping into the analytical adult, which is very distracting if you're trying to capture childhood experience. Mm-hmm. So I forced myself by being in the present tense, which is often pretty hard because you can't have adult thoughts going on. But I forced myself to write it that way. And then when I got older, it was quite a relief. I could actually write more about what I thought. And it goes through the patterns that I did repeat, actually, to some degree, and what I tried to do to deal with that all the way to my mother's death, which was a chance to be with someone. It's called Don't Call Me Mother because when I was 20 years old, I finally visited my mother in Chicago. And she told me not to call her mother in front of other people because no one knew she had a daughter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which is a little upsetting because, I saw her through my life, but, she came to see me. It was all under her control. And so I felt quite thrown away and rejected at that point. And I decided I would get her to change her mind. I would get her to claim me. And she couldn't. On her deathbed, maybe she did. Maybe. She couldn't talk.
Right.
So it was a bit of a journey.
Right. It sounds like it. So what about Song of the Plains? Was Song of the Plains the first one or your second one?
It was the second one.
That was the second one. Okay.
So I thought I was done. We all hear people say, is there another memoir? No. Oh my God. Please. But what happened is that I realized that the adult me who'd been in 30 some years of therapy, who'd been a therapist for many years, and I've been practicing learning what are the lessons that I've learned about the generations, about what happens in people's lives. And I realized that I had more to learn. Not only that, I started looking further for deeper understanding of my mother and grandmother through Ancestry.com. Oh my God. So a whole bunch of stuff showed up about my grandmother. Now, I knew she'd gone to England. She used to talk about England. I thought she'd gone once. She would talk about the war. I am interested in history for that reason because of her and her interests, which we might talk about later. But I I had no idea she had gone to England 5 times. And I realized this whole person that I'd only gotten a part of was trying to have a bigger and better life. And I think due to manic depressive illness and other unhealed things, she sort of collapsed. And by the end of her life with me, she was not that person. And that was the person that was in Don't Call Me Mother.
Right.
The other thing is that I had done 40 years of research about our general family. They were pioneers. Where did they come from? And how did they get to Iowa? And I'd heard all the old stories from the old people when I was a little girl. Well, there they were on Ancestry.com. All the names were there. And I'm like, oh, so what happened about 20 years ago, quite accidentally, you don't never know how this will happen. I heard a voice in my head that was sort of biblical sounding. And it had a cadence, you know, and they begat that person, and that happened. And in this sort of big, large voice, I'm like, I don't know what this is. So I took dictation. I wrote that story, and it's been sitting around marinating. And when I was putting together Song of the Plains, which is my adult view of things, all of a sudden I went, oh, the 40 years of research and that voice goes in this book. And so it's in the middle of the book in a whole different thing called an interlude, speaking of new structures.
Yeah.
And then I also had written through 20 years of whatever writing I was doing about my mother and grandmother. I wrote from their point of view when my mother was a little girl and she would wait for her mother to visit her, as I had, right? But I had pictures of my mother. She was a beautiful little girl. And I saw her brokenness. And I saw her desire just to be loved, you know? And I was like, oh my God, you know? So I wanted to capture that, not just the woman who said, you're not my daughter. She was more than that. Ooh, makes me emotional to think about it right now. And the same for my grandmother. You know, she was born in 1894 to no father, barefoot farm girl, who the only way in those days to get into a better, different life is to marry up. So she did. She eloped when she was 16, not pregnant, didn't need to elope for that reason, married a middle-class boy, and she got out of the farm. And then they divorced eventually, and she married somebody that had actual money. And he's the guy who sent her to England. So I found it interesting to track all that.
Yeah. And you also found it healing. I mean, like you've mentioned, but there's one quote from the introduction to your Power of Memoir that I just want to read. Writing a memoir turned out to be the path to a greater and deeper healing than I ever would have thought possible. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? You knew that this was going to be helpful for you to undertake this. That was part of your motivation. But how were you surprised by the level of healing that you got through those exercises?
Well, I get surprised even now. And as I work with so many students, I think I figured out the key and the lock for it. So what happens when we write memoir is we become the character, the I character. You know, we, as the protagonist, we are in that moment in the past. And we are living it again. We are walking in our own small shoes of who we were in those days, looking out of the eyes of that person. So we're deeply immersed in a self that maybe no longer quite exists in the same way. And we present that world and we live in it and we walk in it. The narrator, however, is us back here, the writer. We have perspective. We've lived another 40 or 50 years. Well, I have another 40 or 50 years beyond that. And that narrator and that writer is able to infuse both the lived scenes with a lot of detail and specificity, but also offer this perspective. And so here I am sounding like a therapist now. So in my mind,
that's okay. You are one, so that's okay.
Yeah. The two eyes have to intersect and interact, and they do it in our unconscious as well as our conscious mind. And in that act, hundreds of thousands of them, as you're writing a book, things get integrated in a new way. You can feel it bodily. I mean, physically, when I finished Song of the Plains, which was a deep forgiveness experience for everybody, including my father, who isn't the main character, but some stuff happened that, that I needed to deal with. And I had done all those years of research on him too. So I was just trying to figure all this out. I felt so free. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'd done many years of therapy too, but the writing, it comes out of your body.
Right. Right. And brings together the pieces inside your body, inside your spirit that need to be reintegrated. So you made a comment. So thank you for that. And you made a comment earlier, and this is something that I was already going to ask you about, some people sort of dismiss memoir as like, it's not your therapy session. Don't just share your therapy sessions with me. How do you navigate that line, right? Between the fact that it is a healing experience for the writer. They are revisiting stuff and integrating stuff and being transformed as a result of writing the memoir. And yet it also has to resonate with the readers if it's going to be a book. So how do you navigate that line so that it's not just this self-indulgent me, but has a universal resonance?
The secret sauce is writing in scene and grounding the reader in a real place and time and reflecting from within. Not dumping. Don't dump your memoir. Your generally don't include your therapy session except in little bite-sized pieces as absolutely necessary if needed. I mean, I'm very conservative about that in the feedback that I give people because we're processing it in here. What the reader cares about is who you are as a person. How did you figure it out? Yeah, your therapist said something, it triggered what in you, what memory, what feeling. So you do your reflection in scene, which means you're grounded in a place and a time, and you balance it out with pacing. Just like any kind of other writing that you do, you have to learn the craft of, pacing and narration and scene and characterization, and come up with a story that's interesting for someone else. And that means also Brooke and I teach the idea of a takeaway. You do turn it outward at times and make a general, perhaps metaphor or an image that everyone can relate to.
Right.
Maybe not in every reflection, not in every scene, but in your later drafts, it's much easier to do that than maybe at the beginning.
Right. Right. So the last question I want to ask sort of along these lines of healing and is something you said that I really liked. And this was from your May 8th webinar. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the conference that's coming later. Mm-hmm. But something you said in that webinar on May 8th was, quote, once it's on the page, you become the witness. And that changes your relationship with what happened. So I really liked that notion. Can you just speak to that just for a moment?
Yes, that comes from Alice Miller, who was, she's dead now, but a well-known, and she might still have a website, writer about abuse and healing. And she talks about and of course, as a therapist, I become a witness to the story that people are telling me as a therapist or a minister, a nurse, policeman, could be anybody, a good friend. She says the difference in what helps people and the people who get better versus the people who don't is if you have a compassionate witness. And so then that person sees you, really sees you, is not just listening, but sees you and holds you with empathy, holds you with compassion. And the trouble is when people are traumatized and abused, they often have trouble holding themselves that way. They can't yet, or not enough, And so we do become our own compassionate witness. We really do need our editors and our coaches and our writing groups who don't edit our life, but receive it, and really deeply listen. So it is shocking. I used to do writing groups for therapists. I was so they could get their CEU units back in the day before we did it online. And I'd have 20 people in the room, therapists who'd worked on themselves quite a bit. By then you have to, if you're going to become a therapist, you have to do therapy and all that. And 100% of the time, A, they would cry, and B, they would go, oh my God, I've worked on this for years and I had no idea about this. Whatever they just wrote, however they wrote it, the words that came out, the way they showed up on the page. It was mind-blowing. It was incredibly interesting and exciting. And we'd all go, wow, every single time. And it still happens. I mean, I'm not in those groups with people, but in the coaching and in the teaching, people come at first with, this is what I'm writing and this is what I'm going to do. And then they go, oh, shit.
This is what I'm actually writing.
This is not what I planned. Are
right.
you kidding? What am I going to do now? There's that it parallels our lives. There's this sort of creative crisis, dark night of the soul, if you will. Mm-hmm. And then we go, it's okay. It's okay. Yay.
It's actually an opportunity. It's actually the opportunity. The door is opening. Yeah. I love that. So much more that we could probably do a whole chat on just the healing aspects of memoir, but I do want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a couple times or mentioned a couple times about how you teach, and oftentimes with Brooke, you guys frequently teach together. In your classes, I'm curious, what do you notice are the most common, and maybe we've already touched on this, maybe there's not a lot to add here, but I'm curious the motivations of the people who are coming to your classes typically.
I've always wanted to write my story, and I decided I had to do it now. So when we saw your webinar the other day, somebody said something that went, oh, I've got to contact them. Yeah. So something they've had this aha moment where they realize they've been thinking about it for a long time, and they have that aha moment. They're like, now's the time. And that's one thing. And another one is, I didn't think I dared, but I see that all these other people are doing it, and maybe I do dare. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That helps, right? So what are some of the key premises? Again, this could be a 6-hour course, and actually I think it is a 6-month course actually. But what are just some high level premises that you recommend to people who are starting out writing their memoir? You mean some advice, some how to sort of things? Okay. Well, first, be patient and know that the creative process is itself unpredictable. And so no matter how much you are sure you're going to get X number of chapters written, leave room for the muse to show up and say, not so fast, without throwing out the project. I mean, some people just want to go, never mind, forget it. And if you're with a good coach or editor or teacher or whoever it might be, they'll say the same thing I'm saying. They'll say, wait a second, come on, maybe you just need to look at this part. You need to hang in there and see what else is coming. And so part of that process is being willing to go into silence and going into not knowing. Mm-hmm. And in not knowing and in, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing, and really listening. I did this with Song of the Plains. I had written 85,000 words already. They weren't right. The voice was not right. The story was not right. I went, oh my God, this is not going to work. And so I shut down the machine of writing, and I refused to even, how your brain can write even when you're not writing. Mm-hmm. I said, no writing, no brain writing, just read, relax, watch movies, garden, play with your kitties, have fun. And in 6 weeks, come back and see if the voice has started yet. So I waited until I could hear the new voice. So Song of the Plains has its own several voices. And the first lines of the book that it is now came to me. I went, hark, maybe this is it. So I wrote those down. So that's part of it. And that first, if I may interject, I would argue that those first 85,000 words, as painful as it is to kill our darlings, as we say, that was actually part of your process, right? I mean, that was getting the ideas flowing, that was getting it out there. And then, unfortunately, or ultimately fortunately, but in the moment, it feels very unfortunate that you've written 85,000 words that you realize you're not going to use. I was fine with it. I kind of suspected it before I got all the way to 85. Well, I've written a lot by now, and I know that you should not get too completely attached.
But people who haven't written a lot, I think it's a really important lesson, right? And just something that you said about structure and allowing for that muse, that was something that I learned with my first novel that I didn't finish, which was I realized that that I needed to have enough structure to get to the end, but not so much structure that the muse couldn't show up and have allow for these impromptu, spontaneous moments of creativity and plot twists and all that sort of thing. So I love how the creative process works in that sense. Other advice that you would give at a high level for?
Yeah, be willing to learn from being a journaler or an academic writer, to learn about what storycraft is all about, what a scene is and what it does, the power of the scene, a structure, just write down a bunch of significant moments and make a list. If you want to know how to just get started, make a list. This is what we do in our class and what I did to write Don't Call Me Mother. When I didn't have a teacher helping me do it, I'm like, I got to figure something out here. And so writing down, this is a significant moment, it needs to be in the story. This one, this one, this one. And it builds a spine. And to not think that the first thing you write will necessarily be your first chapter. It's just the first thing you're writing.
And if I make a list, let's say I make a list of life events that seem significant to me, sometimes I might get overwhelmed because maybe I've had a life full of significant events. So how do I narrow it down?
Sorry, I didn't add. We tell people to write down 20 of them.
Okay. So you actually give them sort of some parameters
write down
there.
20 and write those stories and also put them on a timeline so you can sort of see what you've got. And it may or may not be thematic yet. Maybe it is too long or somewhat autobiography oriented, but the process of doing that leads you to the next step and the next step and the next step of focusing in and going, oh, it's really about this. As I did with Song of the Plains, I mean, that book is a different book than the other one. I mean, there's themes that are similar, but it's a different book.
Something else you mentioned early on is that, you have 2 memoirs, other memoirists might have more than 2 memoirs, right? Some that's their genre.
Right.
If I've got my list of 20 life events, for example, since that's the example we're using, how might I define the scope and realize that actually, you know what? These first 5 are probably one memoir, and the next ones might be a set. How do you kind of define the scope of a memoir?
Well, usually, some people nowadays, more people are planning for more than one memoir. Back in the day, it was like, who do you think you are that you have even more than one memoir in you? Like, shut up, those voices, in the world. The society will say this, that's part of the inner critic that we also help people with. But there may be sequels. There may be thematically the childhood coming of age memoir. And then, okay, so you got that far. Well, what happened next? I mean, not trudging along. Well, I got married and then I had a baby and then I blah, blah, blah. Okay. But what meaning did that have to you? How did you grow? How did you change? What did you learn that we want to learn from you? That you learned that you can share with us, and whatever those things are. I mean, Dani Shapiro, how many? 5? She's written like 5 memoirs, and many and other people too. But I think more students now are going, well, this is the first one.
Right.
The trouble is sometimes they go, well, I have so many. Maybe they do and maybe they don't. And so what we like to see them do is, okay, what if you did want to put more than coming of age in one book? What would that look like? And so why don't you sketch it out? Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Let's at least look at it and see if you really, because some people have trouble getting through one book. I mean, it is a big deal to write even one book and may or may not get to the other one. We hope they will. But sometimes they just need help with the scope of their idea.
Right. Let's not plan a trilogy just yet. Let's do a little exploration first and make sure. Right. So can you talk, we're kind of venturing into this territory, I guess. So that was some advice, some how to, what are some not to do, some things, some pitfalls to kind of look out for?
Don't share it with your family. At least not for a long time. Be careful about, I mean, it's very, I mean, this is a whole other thing. It's very revealing and exposing to write a memoir, even if you just have a writing group read it. If you get into a writing group that wants to edit your life, you need to think about another writing group where they're not critiquing what you did or what your family did, but how you're presenting your story.
And is that, it sounds like that's a common issue, is that people, that line gets blurred?
It can be, especially if, not always. I mean, there's some things that totally work out, but I've seen some wounded writers show up going, this happened to me. So those are the ones I'm talking about, or a memoir fiction group where we'll just change that and change that. It'll make a better story. I'm like, don't listen to those people. Mm-hmm. Well, unless it's just they're saying, well, you got to enhance the dialogue, and maybe what color dress did somebody wear? Well, do your best,
right.
Changing the story and changing who is there and what actually happened. Jim Fry again, be careful about that. So, but I think the thing about sharing too soon is the biggest cause of people falling off being able to keep going, mm-hmm. or getting really harsh feedback. And so sometimes also an editor or a coach can give you feedback that makes you feel like you can't stand it. Now, most people don't do that to hurt you, but so back up and go, well, can I talk to this person about how they affected me? Or do I just know this is the wrong fit? You have to make decisions like that along the way sometimes, because
mm-hmm.
you do want to learn, and you will hear things you do not like, no matter who is talking to you. You know this, I know this. When you get edited or when you get coached, it's like, no, don't tell me that. But
are you sure? I thought it was perfect. Yeah.
It's a brilliant idea.
Right. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
maybe you just don't understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
You're missing that. Yeah.
Or I see it in 20 pages from here. Are you in a hurry or what?
Mm-hmm.
I get that one a lot. Like, well, if I'm confused on page 5 and I need to know that now so I can keep reading, just think about putting it a little sooner.
Right. A question about craft, and you just mentioned writing scenes, and you said, or you say rather, on magicofmemoir.com on your website for that, you said, quote, "There is nothing more important in memoir writing than mastering scenes." Mm-hmm. So can you touch on that again, and just a few words of advice on how to master scene? Again, I know that's another 6-month course probably, but just some tidbits. Yeah.
I have the elevator speech for that.
I thought you might.
So a scene is a moment in time where you're embodied in the age of who you were at that moment in time. And so people get confused, but let's say you're 5 years old. All right. So then if you go off into, now I think this and I remember that, you've left that child point of view. So now when we're teaching, we say, keep in mind throughout the whole scene where your body is. Where are your feet planted literally in that scene? And don't leave your feet behind, at least while you're writing that scene. So it's where you are, when, and the age that you are, the age. So we have people outline this before they write a scene. What is the point of this scene? So on your turning points, this is the day that my father came home from the war. Great. That's the theme of the scene. It doesn't mean you can't have breakfast and go play with your dog also while you wait for your father to come home, and you're not sure how he'll feel, and you don't know how you'll feel. You don't know what'll happen. You can have all that. But the theme is the day that he came home and what happened. Mm-hmm. Right. And so you want to keep that meat. Something significant happens. Did you go, it can't just be, I got up, I had breakfast, I went to the store, and I waited for the phone to ring. Well, okay. What's the emotional tension or conflict or desire that is happening for you, no matter how old you are, in that scene? Something you need, something you want, something you don't want. That's the engine, sort of like the hurricane just went by. That's that center red thing. In a scene, there needs to be this thing that is driving you through it. And I think in memoir writing, and I know I was this way, I was like, well, I don't like conflict. I'm a peaceful person. Mm-hmm, There's plenty of conflict in my life, for God's sake. But, it was the idea of, you mean I have to write conflict? Some of this come from, but I'm not a thriller writer, and I don't want to have car crashes. Okay, it's not about that. Well, hopefully not, but something internal that is, tugging at you. And so if that's happening, then you do your best to fill in, who are you talking with? It can be all reflection. So there's narration, there's dialogue, there's characterization. These are aspects of writing a scene. These are challenging because in characterization, we're characterizing ourselves as well as other people, and they happen to be people we knew or know, worse, and are related to. And who might read it? Oh my God, and so this really can slow people down. They tend to flatten characterization if they're worried about it. But we say, look, and I always taught this, pretend like you're in a dome of protected sacred space when you're writing.
Mm-hmm.
Bring it over your head when you're sitting at the computer and write from a place of safety and truth that belongs to you. And we have to do this, or we will not get the essence of our own truth and our own story out there. And then you go in and you can later, when you're going to be published, you can change the way you describe somebody if you think it's offensive. You can do things later, but make the first 2 to 5 drafts just your own gritty and honest sense of these people and yourself and what happened and how you understand it.
So I think that's a really good point. Obviously, I mean, well, there are lots of really good points there, but the one that I'm commenting now on is that idea that, you've got those several drafts, just go at it in those drafts, completely protected, completely buffered from the outside world. But then is it just personal? Is it just case by case, or are there any sort of guidelines with how much to share or what to share, particularly as you've cited a couple of times, when the people are still alive and
Right.
when they might be really not happy with your characterization, or they might even dispute that something that you're saying happened. So
it happens so much.
Yeah. So how do you navigate that? Or is it, like I said, pretty case by case and your own comfort level?
I have some general things I can say for sure. Yeah, it's case by case. And how close are you to these people is one question to ask. And what do you imagine will happen if you do or don't tell them about your book and they find out? I don't recommend that. I've seen people book bomb people.
Really? Yeah,
Oh
that
my
seems
God.
scary.
I don't know. As a therapist, I'm, kind of not on that wavelength, but people do it because they're scared. I mean, I understand why. Can you have a conversation with that person? Yes, no. It needs to be a logic chart. Yes, you can. Okay, great. Then what do you want to say to them? One thing to watch out for, are you asking them permission to write about them? Are you telling them that you wrote about them?
Important
and you
distinction.
did your best to be honest and blah, 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 and that the book is coming out. So people have different kinds of relationships with people. So some people, they give it to their kids, they give it to their family members, they all talk it over. This is a rather high level of functioning kind of family, if that happens. But for a lot of people, there's abusers in the story. There's sometimes legal issues in the story, and truly everybody that even wonders if it's okay should contact a literary attorney. I mean, they all ask me. I'm not a literary attorney. I can say one or two things about privacy, and I'm not going to give advice on that to anyone because it's a big deal, to really get good information on that. So a lot of different gateways later in the process, but we're talking about like a fully edited draft, getting closer to publication situation here. We're talking a year or two in probably.
Right. Thank you. Lots of good advice. And yeah, the legal thing, I'm sure you get lots of questions. You're like, not me. I am not a lawyer here.
I do talk about what to watch out for. People say, if I tell the truth, nobody can sue me. No. Not true.
Oh, that it were that
if they're
easy.
writing fiction, they say that. Well, Robin Hemley wrote a whole book on how to write fiction out of your life, and he has a huge chapter of about 50 pages long on the legal problems of writing fiction.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue, because my next question was, before we went on today, you mentioned that a lot of memoirists are and I don't know if I understood this correctly, but I don't know if they're turning their memoirs into fiction or if they're writing fictionalized memoirs.
Mhm.
And can you talk to that sort of trend and your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, forever people have been turning their life into fiction. Look at Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and
We
everybody
write what
else
we know.
before and after. So that's not, people talk about that like that's a new thing. I just don't get it. But anyway, that's another subject. But so people do need to decide what shelf their book is going to be on, and the memoir needs to be your truth as best as you can present it, as accurately as you can, as this is my truth that I live. Okay, fiction. Now, some people want to fictionalize their memoir, which means it's not a fictionalized memoir. That is not the correct title of the genre. It's fiction, period. Based on your life. You know, like on TV, you'll see based on a story by.
Right.
Okay. It's fiction, however. It will go in the fiction section. It needs to work well as fiction, not, oh, but if you only know this is really what happened to me, well, then make it a memoir. You see, so people have to choose. Are people doing all of this? Yes, they're all doing all of it, and always have been. And some people are just more comfortable fictionalizing their story, let's call it, not their memoir, fictionalizing their story for legal reasons, for exposure reasons, so they don't have to answer questions in the book reading or by the family. Did that really happen? Because they can get out of that more or less, except for the people that know you very well and know exactly what happened because they were there.
Right. Interesting. I think that's another really good distinction. It's just fiction. If you're gonna fictionalize it, it's just fiction. I think that's the takeaway from.
I really get on people's cases about calling it fictionalized memoir.
Yep. So we've mentioned Brooke a couple times. You guys teach together, and you co-authored 2 books together. And as I said already, we're going to talk about a conference that you have coming up. But you don't focus only on memoir. You also kind of hone in even more specifically about women's memoir. And so at a high level, again, can you just touch on how writing memoir is different for women than it is for men?
Well, I mean, all I know for women is that many women feel that their voices have not been heard enough and they weren't respected for their point of view and their experience enough, not ever, but not enough. And many of us, I'm a little older than you, I mean, shut up, don't talk, who do you think you are kind of stuff for years. In fact, there was a period of time about 30, maybe 35 years ago where I couldn't write a word even in my journal.
Mm-hmm.
I could not.
You were so shut down.
I have no right, and I was embarrassed to even put into words things. And I meet people like this now, and I had to work on it myself. I'm like, I knew what was wrong, but I was like, whoa, well, there's a lot of stuff, about that. And so Brooke created She Writes Press, and we teach to everyone in Write Your Memoir in 6 months, but the largest majority of people that join us are women, often older women who are also going, you mean I get to say this? I get to write this? Mm-hmm. And we have men joining us as well, and we welcome them and we make space for them fully as people who also, and some of these men may be men who didn't feel they had a voice either, for whatever reason. If you're not a certain kind of man, well, go away and leave us alone. We're drinking our beer,
I do know, as a matter of fact. I do know.
You do. I bet you do.
Uh-huh.
I was blessed as a child. I grew up in music, and I knew these boys who played the violin and the cello, and they were so different from those tough guys who were scary men, scary boys. And I learned how they thought and felt as sensitive boys. And it really enhanced my immediate early ability to go, oh, these are men too. They're sensitive and they're listening, and I want to hold a place for them. And so Brooke and I do that as well.
Right. I want to go back a step to something you said a moment ago, which was, how you initially, when you started to try to write, you couldn't even write. And how did you get over that hump and move those obstacles out of the way so that you realized, no, I can do this and I deserve to do this. I'm worthy of doing this. And so how did you do that yourself personally? And then how do you help others who aren't there yet?
Well, there's a phrase in therapy you probably have heard, and it's called the way out is through.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew why I couldn't write. It was shame. Now, do people come to our classes and do we come to our writing with shame, particularly memoir writers, maybe fiction writers too, you know? Yes. So I'm one of these grit your teeth, and I was in therapy. And so I just went, damn it. I mean, it actually made me angry that I was so stuck. Well,
Sure.
Anger is an energy, and I just swear and stomp around and go write down more shameful things and burn with it and just suffer through it. I mean, I'm like, this is the only way out. We can't, because it's in the body. These things like shame and trauma, it's in the body. I've done a lot of body work. I know a lot about the body and body work. And in fact, it comes, in writing. Brooke and I talk about this in our teaching as well. So I just did it sentence by sentence, and gradually I survived writing whatever. It wasn't all about shame, but I just felt ashamed as a human being because my mother's thing of "you're not my daughter, go away," was
Sure.
a huge shaming thing. My father did a similar thing. So I was still just trying to be like allowed to be a person, walk around on two legs, and I know a lot of other people struggle with that. So in our classes, we talk about the inner critic, the outer critic, and the issue of shame. We had a whole program on breaking silence as part of my National Association of Memoir Writing offerings too, where everybody that came on the program was talking about how they broke their silences, because we're silent quite often because of shame and having been traumatized. So a sentence by sentence, write that thing you cannot write, and then stop and go do something fun. Maybe you write one sentence. Then next time you'll write two or three. Maybe you'll then write a paragraph, but you cannot fix it inside here. At least that's what I've seen.
Yeah. Thank you. So speaking of voices being challenged, let's say not necessarily silenced, but challenged, there's an issue that you mentioned that one woman memoir faced. Let me try that again. There's a lot of W's. One woman memoirist. Actually, there weren't a lot of W's. Anyway, just a lot of sounds I was struggling with. I think it's the O's. It's the one woman memoirist. There was a very public sort of blowing up between two memoirists, right? And in response to this, and I'm talking about, well, I'm going to let you actually explain it. But in response to what happened recently in the New York Times, you and Brooke have organized an upcoming conference to touch on a lot of what we've just been talking about. So but it was interesting too, because the person one of the people at the center of what happened is someone with whom you've had on your podcast. You seem to be very big fans on. So I'm sure that even complicated your reaction to what happened. But can you tell people what happened and kind of what's ensuing as a result, and what you're doing with your conference as a result?
Well, you just never know, what'll happen next about this. And all of this is, we respect every writer and where they're coming from. And not every writer likes every other writer's work. It doesn't mean they don't like the person. It isn't personal. But Gina Frangelo wrote a memoir that kind of hit the ground running. It came out in the spring, called Blow the House Down. And she is, she puts it all out there. She has an unusual structure and an unusual voice, and she covers a lot of different subjects in that book. Also, Danny Shapiro, who I mentioned earlier, who we've had teach with us and everything, she's got a different sensibility, and she wrote a negative review in the New York Times. And of course, if you see a negative review by anybody in the New York Times, you go, I better read the book.
Right.
So I read the book in a day. I could not put it down, Gina's book. And one of Danny's critiques is it was very, very angry, and a few other things. I don't remember all the details now, but I read it and I'm like, oh, I don't see anger there, but I see all these other things and things that thematically connected to me, including the issue of shame, including what do you have a right to do as a woman, and what can you, in the eventual theme of all of this kerfuffle that happened on social media too, was what do we have a right to write about, and can we break whatever society's, beyond any person, society's view of what women have a right to do and say. I mean, it's still that same issue that women were facing in 1920 when they had the right to vote. It's just coming out in a different way. And so much happened that Brooke and I then gave a free webinar where 1,000 people signed up.
1,000 people. Wow. you may have hit a nerve. Yeah. Wow. That's fantastic.
500 were on Zoom at the same time.
Wow.
It was free, but
yeah. Well, still, I don't care. Even though it was free. No. We're not going to minimize this. That really speaks to how you were speaking to this issue, and women really resonating.
This needs to be talked about.
Yeah.
And so we did, and we just had a discussion. I mean, Brooke and I, we just had a slight outline, and we just had an open discussion like we're having, and we went wherever we went with it. And out of that, we decided, well, so many women in particular are needing to look at these issues of shame and anger, and do you have a right to X, whatever it is, find a new structure, that we wanted to create a conference about that. And so that is what's coming up, in October, Women Writing Memoir, and people can find it. Or do you want to say it, or shall I say it?
You can say it. It's your conference. I have it, but you can say it since it's your conference.
It's on www.magicofmemoir.com is where it's located, and you can all find out about that.
And I do want to mention, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I do want to mention the 5 teachers that you're going to have.
Yes.
Do you know them off the top of your head, or shall I?
Well, you go ahead, because I was trying to find it.
Okay, perfect. Piper Kerman, Orange is the New Black. Elizabeth Niamayaro, I Am a Girl from Africa. Nadia Boltz-Weber, Pastrix. Farouz Dumas, Funny in Farsi. Gina Frangelo, Blow Your House Down. So the woman we were just talking about in the book we were just talking about. And Lily Danziger, who I also had on the show a couple months ago, Negative Space. Loved talking with her and loved that book. Yeah. And so I know that she in particular, because she's the only one I know out of the 4 or out of the 5 personally, I know that she will, she'll be a great participant and great teacher. So, some of the topics I just want to mention, the art of true confessions, writing the hard, sometimes taboo truths, the community stories, finding anger in your story, which is, can you even do that? And writing through scary and hard stuff, and writing about shame. So we are covering a lot of the topics that came up in that discussion with Gina originally. And these are things that we see everybody in different amounts struggle with in the classes that we do. Right. The kerfuffle was just a nice impetus to talk about this stuff that it sounds like already needed. There was already a need and a desire for people to talk about this. Right.
In memoir writing in general, and many other teachers talk about that too.
Right. Tell me again the dates. I don't know if we said the dates.
And so it is, one second, I'm getting it all up here.
That I didn't write
okay, down. So it is Mondays starting the 4th of October.
Right.
And it goes through the 8th of November. And we're also having an additional bit attached to their presentation, which is we hold a writing session afterward. So everybody gets in little groups on Zoom, and we have them write for a few minutes on the topic and share with each other on Zoom, which is an amazing creation. Yeah. And so you can have actual sharing with each other in a fair, kind of balanced way. We did this last year during a pandemic where we found out that people were desperate for a writing group where they can write and be the compassionate witness for each other and get it for themselves. So we added that.
Wonderful. I love that you're doing that. And I'm sure it's going to be a big success again between you and Brooke and the 5 or 6 women that are teaching and speaking along with you. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. So everybody check that out. And Linda Joy, I could talk to you obviously for another hour or two or three, but we have come to the end. So thank you so much for making the time to be here today and talk with us about memoir. I really appreciate it.
So easy to talk with you, Matthew.
It's easy to talk with you. So we will definitely do it again sometime. So thanks again. And so we mentioned magicofmemoir.com, but you have a couple other websites in parting. Your personal website, for example, you might want to mention.
LindaJoyMeyersAuthor.com and the National Association of Memoir Writers, which is NAMW.org. And we have programs every month. We have a free program every month, and we have member events. There's a lot going on. People can see what's going on. We have videos of the other presenters that we've had, and
book club. I think you have a book club. Do you have a book club as well?
It's called Virtual Book Club, and that's our free event every month where we talk to regular people about how they wrote their memoir, how they got it done.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Linda. Thank you, everybody. I'm Matthew Felix. More about me at MatthewFelix.com and more about the San Francisco Writers Conference, including details about this year's writing contest, lots of upcoming events, and best of all, how to register for the conference, which we hope and are planning that will be in person, barring any more COVID surprises, but it's scheduled to be, fingers crossed, February President's Weekend, February 2022, but you can register now. So please check it out and register, and we hope to see you there. Again, that's sfwriters.org. So until next time, thanks for joining us.